I call the Environmental Stewardship Committee meeting to order on June 4th, 2024. Good afternoon and welcome to the June 4th, 2024 meeting of the Mecklenburg County Environmental Stewardship Committee. I am Mecklenburg County Commissioner Elaine Powell and I serve as the chair. We are committed to the important work of maintaining, enhancing, protecting, and preserving our environment so that all residents will thrive. A virtual attendance option is offered as an alternate mode of accessibility to our meeting today. We welcome the public who have been provided a call-in number to access this meeting. Those attending virtually are asked to display your full name on the Zoom, as attendance will be recorded for the minutes. Additionally, virtual attendees are asked to remain muted and use the chat box to submit your comments or questions to be read aloud by the committee. The agenda, meeting minutes, and presentations for today were sent out to those already on the distribution list. If anyone did not receive these and you would like an electronic copy, please make your request via email to Erin Stanforth. Her email address is Erin, E-R-I-N, Stanforth, S-T-A-N-F-O-R-T-H at mecnc.gov. We will begin today's meeting by having each board member identify him or herself so that the record will reflect who is present and participating in the meeting. I am Mecklenburg County Commissioner Elaine Powell. I represent the people of District 1 in North Mecklenburg and serve as chair of the Environmental Stewardship Committee. Next, I will ask my colleagues to make their introductions as I call out their district. District 4.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Mark Jarrell, District 4, also serving as Vice Chair of the Board.
District 6.
Good afternoon. My name is Susan Rodriguez McDowell, and I'm elected by the people of District 6.
At large.
Good afternoon, Lee Altman, County Commissioner serving at large.
Thank you. For the record, all commissioners have acknowledged their presence for the meeting. Therefore, we have a quorum. I will now ask Erin Stanforth to introduce everyone who's joining us today in person and virtually.
Perfect. Online with us, we have Britt Clampett, Dave Cable, Don Ciccarelli, Ebenezer Giarlaputi, Aaron Olivero, Gordon Miller, Hope Wright, Jeff Smithberger, Pam Escobar, Shauna Caldwell, Susan Hall, and Lee Jones. My name is Erin Stanforth. I serve as the Sustainability and Resiliency Manager for Mecklenburg County, and I'll pass it to you.
Kathleen Reed, Sustainability Consultant for Mecklenburg County.
Clint Brooks, Sustainability Consultant for Mecklenburg County.
Bert Lynn, Capital Planning Division Director for Park and Recreation.
Chris Matthews, Division Director, Nature Preserves and Natural Resources, Park and Rec.
Beth Matthias, Davidson Lands Conservancy.
Sean Bloom, Catawba Lands Conservancy.
Katie Daughtry, Mecklenburg County Park and Rec.
Good afternoon, Leslie Johnson, Deputy County Manager.
Amanda Byram, Catawba Lands Conservancy.
Krista Rogers, Park and Rec Natural Resources Manager.
Thank you. And in the spirit of John Autry, at some point, I just wanted the audience members to know that I see you. I know you're here. And eventually I'll ask you if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you. Since we just received the minutes, and I do understand what happened. So I think Kathleen thought she attached them, but she attached the framework twice. And so we just got the minutes. And so I would ask my colleagues to just delay the vote for the minutes to the next meeting. Do we need to vote on that? Okay, we'll just delay that to the next meeting. Thank you. And now I will recognize one of the best employees in Mecklenburg County, Bert Lynn, Capital Planning Division Director with Mecklenburg County's Park and Recreation Department, to discuss park dedication and fee in lieu as it relates to the UDO, Unified Development Ordinance, because we're not going to use acronyms. Okay?
I'll do my best.
Try really hard.
I will try very hard.
All right.
Thank you, Commissioner Powell, commissioners. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss a relatively new process that was included within the updated City of Charlotte Unified Development Ordinance. With me today is Katie Daughtry, planner with Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation, who has been part of my team that has worked quite a bit with the city staff in the development of the Unified Development Ordinance and to identify opportunities to set aside public open space for future park and recreation use as land within the city is developed and redeveloped in the future. The solution to achieve this goal is provided in the form of open space incentives. So that's what we'll talk about that process today. This is a different standalone process from the tree save or green area requirements that we've discussed in previous stewardship committee meetings. In this case, these incentives will be provided directly to Mecklenburg County to be used to expand access to public open space. Following today's presentation and discussion, this information will come to the board for approval of this new process. So the new City of Charlotte Unified Development Ordinance was effective June 1st, 2023, just over a year ago. Within the Unified Development Ordinance, the open space incentive that we're going to be discussing today applies to all zoning districts with the exception of most of the R1 or residential 1 districts. It only applies to one of those 6 districts. And these are the districts that include primarily single family homes, but also duplexes, triplexes, and I think in some cases townhomes. The new incentive for developers provides 2 options. Option A is to dedicate open space to Mecklenburg County for park and recreation use. And we'll go into some more details here in just a minute. And option B allows developers to pay a fee in lieu of providing the required open space on their property. So if we move to the next slide, we'll go into a little bit more detail on these 2 processes. So we'll start with option A. So this option provides developers the opportunity to dedicate land to Mecklenburg County for park and recreation uses. The developer would receive a 10% open space reduction, with the 90% of the required open space being dedicated directly to the county. The conversations that we've had to date with developers are developers who have larger sites where that 10% reduction in open space would provide them an opportunity to build more units or square footage of office or retail, however they plan to develop their site. We are not just going to accept any type of land donation. We need to make sure that it's developable land. And we've included certain land dedication standards that we will review for each proposed dedication. Those include kind of unified. We want a single parcel of land or parcels that are adjacent to one another. We need to make sure that the property is developable, that it's usable. The shape of it is such that, it's not a really long, skinny piece of property. The topography isn't too steep. It allows for some flat areas for ease of development. The location within the context of that development and the context outside of that development makes it easy for all residents, not just residents who live in that new development, to access that open space. And from an access standpoint, the land needs to include frontage and access from a public street. Under this option, Mecklenburg County would own the property fee simple. The county would also have the ability to protect the land using one or more of the conservation preservation mechanisms that we'll be discussing later in the meeting. The second option developers have is we call option B, fee in lieu of providing open space. This provides the developer the opportunity to develop more of their property. The county then has the opportunity to use the fees to acquire open space for future park and recreation use on another nearby site. So they have a little bit more of their site to go in and develop. The conversations that we've had to date on this are typically on smaller parcels where the amount of open space really is too small to make a huge difference there. So this optional is allowed under the North Carolina general statutes. These statutes are very clear in that the value of the property is determined by the assessed tax value of the development site. And so we'll look at an example here on the next slide. It's math time for those who love math.
Dun, dun, dun.
So we thought it'd be helpful to illustrate how this fee is to be calculated and then allocated. So the equation used is to determine the fee in lieu is relatively simple. First, we determine the total tax value of the project area. That would be all of the land associated with the project. And we divide it by the total acreage of the project. So this gives us a tax value per acre for that project. Next, we would multiply the tax value per acre by the required open space for the project. And this results in the fee in lieu for that specific project. So in the example here, you've got a total tax value of the site of $1 million over 10 acres. And so that gives us a per acre value of $100,000. In this illustrative case, 2 acres are to be dedicated. And so that fee in lieu of would be $200,000, fairly straightforward. Because the fee is paid to offset the fact that the project will not be included, or the project will not include the required open space within that development site, we want to make sure that we are acquiring open space within the same general location. We've developed the map shown here to identify 5 districts within the city of Charlotte, which includes the ETJ or extraterritorial jurisdiction. Fees collected in a district will be spent in the same district. Staff will work to acquire properties as close to the fee in lieu of generation property when and where possible. But we have some flexibility because the areas that we've identified are a little bit larger there. Staff will track when and where the fees are received and how those fees are spent. County Finance has already set up funding lines for each of the 5 districts when we get this process approved. Park and Recreation staff will coordinate with county real estate staff to identify target properties for use of any collected fees. And then real estate staff will continue to share acquisition targets with the board, and then would note specifically those acquisitions that are wholly or partially funded using any fees collected using this process. So this is a relatively straightforward process. It is a new process to the county, and it's a process that hadn't been available to us in previous unified development ordinances. So with that, we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
The one thing I'd say before we go into questions, if you don't mind, is that one of the reasons why we're sharing, because we want the Environmental Stewardship Committee to be familiar, but as Bert just referenced, we will be bringing this to the full board to approve and adopt this process. And so we didn't want this committee not to have opportunity to ask questions, become familiar with it before it becomes a full board agenda item. Thank you.
Commissioner Rodriguez McDowell.
Thank you. So on option A, can I just sort of check out, see if this is right, my understanding?
Mhm.
So if somebody buys a parcel and there's some unusable land on it in that it's like a massive slope, or there's like a creek or something, and they can't build on that part, that's not the part that they can turn to us. Or they can turn it over to us, but that doesn't count toward the 10%.
Correct. Yeah, under the way that this is written, we would not have to accept that. So they could put that forth as what they would dedicate for open space, and we could have a conversation about that. We wouldn't be required to accept that as the open space. And so that would be kind of a conversation starting point there.
Okay, so in that scenario, the developer cannot build on this crappy part, because actually it could be a beautiful part, but it's just not usable for him, for his building. And he cannot give it to us. So that means he has to find another 10% on that same land that he would designate that doesn't include the part he can't build on.
Yeah,
Is that
that's
what you're
correct.
saying?
Yeah, so
It could be 20% of his land that he's not able to use.
they
or-
may choose to use that area that you're talking about as the tree save or the green area.
Uh-huh.
separate requirement from what we're talking about here.
Okay,
Mhm.
and who is going to make the decision about that? Like, does that come to the board to say, or does it come to Park and Rec staff to say, this is not acceptable? We need some other part of,
It would start at the staff level. And so what we would do is we would go and apply the criteria that we have here to that site and let them know whether or not this is acceptable or not. Have that conversation. If we agree upon that, then that would come through the board as we do any acquisition target.
okay. Madam Chair, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so in this scenario, someone gets a large parcel, they turn over 10% to us to make a park, and then we are responsible for funding the park from then on. It becomes our land, and it's like, so we're fully responsible for it.
That's
So
correct.
we could be getting all these little tiny 10% all over the place that we're now responsible for. So it seems like we would need to increase our budget to be able to service all of those parks. Am I right?
Ultimately, yes. Yeah.
So one of the things that we have started to do in the park budget illustratively is, as we've been acquiring land, we've been being intentional to have funding to support maintaining the land. Because historically, the maintenance of the property was once the park was developed. But
Mhm.
because of the capital process and because we've been more intentional and aggressive in buying land, we're buying way more land before we get into a capital timeline. So we're having to staff up in order so that we can maintain the asset until we get into the capital planning, and then offset it with ongoing staff to maintain it that way as well. So over time, as we do that, yes, you'll start seeing other resource needs to accommodate the request.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Altman?
If their land is not big enough, that the 10% is worth it for us to be responsible for the liability and the maintenance, do we still take it? I mean, is it still gotta come to us, even if it's not too small to be useful?
I would imagine, as we understand it, and this is a new space for us.
Right.
We have the opportunity to deny it.
Correct.
So they could somewhere in this path choose to go, okay, option A isn't working. Can we go now to option B and just go ahead and give you the funding because we can't reach that agreement for giving you the land?
I see. So we're gonna get one or the other. That's nice. At our
If-
election?
If they choose, so because this is an incentive, it's not mandated, it's not required. So
Whoa, what?
yes, this is an incentive. So the incentive is that either they have a 10% reduction in the open space that they have to provide, or they pay the fee in lieu of having the open space on their site. So it's not mandated.
If you do one or the other?
Those are the options they have if they choose to use the incentive.
So it's only if they want to increase, is that their density? Oh.
It's how much is it increasing their density?
It doesn't increase the density, it increases the space that they have to develop on the property.
Okay. So I see, because I was gonna say, is this legal? Is this like a taking? If they're choosing it
Correct.
in order to maximize their profitability otherwise?
Yeah, we tried to work through several scenarios as the UDO was being written, Unified Development Ordinance was being written, and tried to look for ways to mandate it. This was the mechanism that everyone felt most comfortable with starting with. However, Unified Development Ordinances can be are amended quite often. And so this is our starting point now, and we'll see where it goes over the next several years and if it needs to be adjusted potentially.
So the money we get as a fee in lieu goes to our line item budget for land acquisition?
So it would be in a standalone account for land acquisition,
Okay, not for
correct?
Maintenance, but.
No. land
Correct.
acquisition.
And the map with the ETJ, I see some ETJ, but not all, like, that's kind of weird.
The area that is outside of the blue area are other municipal boundaries. So because this is just Charlotte's Unified Development Ordinance, we can only spend that money within the Charlotte limits.
This is Charlotte or Charlotte's ETJ.
Correct.
And finally, So when people go to develop basically all properties except residential, they have a tree save requirement and an option to engage in this parkland dedication in order to increase density. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But they will also have an open space requirement as
Right.
well. So they still will have an open space requirement. So say, I'm just illustratively, say out of 100 acres, they have to make 10 acres. That's the requirement that they must put as open space. They then have the option out of that 10 acres to say, I'd rather only make it, I'm messing up my math for 10%. I'd only want to give you 1 acre, to the side. I should have used a larger number so the math would seem more reasonable. Let's go back. Say they have to do, which would never be the case. Say they have to do 100 acres of open space, right? They can say, oh, wow, I'd rather only do 90 acres instead of 100. And that other 10, I'd like to use for this other mass development that I want to use. And so if they wanted, instead of having to do the full requirement per the city's zoning ordinance, they can carve out a part of it and do one of two things. They could either dedicate that amount to the park or to park and recreation, or they can pay money in lieu of dedication that we can use and spend.
And what are you going to be asking for our approval to do exactly? To agree to?
Utilize this process because there's a fee involved or a potential fee involved. All fees are approved by the board.
Okay.
Yep.
Before Commissioner Jarrell, can you tell me like how the timeline, how did you get drawn into this and when?
It was during the writing process for the Unified Development Ordinance, so it probably would have been 2 or 3 years ago at this point.
And it took this long to come up with the plan?
No, this is part of the Unified Development Ordinance. We just haven't gone into board approval yet because all of our conversations to date with any developers who want to take advantage of this have only been conversations. No one's moved forward in it yet. And we've been under the new Unified Development Ordinance for a year or so. We have a developer now who is looking seriously at taking advantage of the incentive. And so we want to go ahead and before they're ready to move, get everything approved by the board.
So throughout the whole process, the UDO is approved in 2023. And throughout the whole process, you're involved, but you're just bringing this forward now.
Correct.
The other thing that I would add to it is staff was involved, Park and Rec staff was involved through the inception of the UDO, edits to the UDO. I know we shared with you some of the edits that we were recommending. So they've been involved all the way to that process. And then when the city adopted their UDO, immediately they're following, Aaron, Katie, Bert started working on what's now the tactical process for if someone ever takes advantage of this, how we legally going to receive the funding from the city to the county and the like. And so they have been behind the scenes working on the criteria and the like, waiting for this opportunity. And this could have been done a month ago or whatever, because they had already been working on it. And now they feel like it's an opportunity to present to you, knowing that we have someone who's already now very interested in taking this incentive and buying, and their interest is to pay the incentive, the fee in lieu of. And so that's kind of the other domino of why this is coming for you now.
Okay, Commissioner Jarrell,
No question.
Commissioner Rodriguez McDowell.
Okay, sorry, but I need help with this. I do not understand what their incentive is exactly. Like, they're trying to build on more than they're already allowed to. They have to already have some amount of space that without this process,
Yeah.
they already have to save some of the land.
Correct.
Okay, how much is that?
So it differs from one zoning area to another, but it typically ranges between 5 and 10% of the project area.
Okay, so I'm thinking of these parcels in my mind that I've seen, and they already have to save between 5 and 10%. And now this makes it so they can save even less than that?
Yeah, so the incentive for option A would be they have a 10% reduction in that.
So 10% of, say, 10%.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So if they were required under this or under their zoning guidelines to set aside 10 acres, they took advantage of this, they would only have to set aside 9 acres.
Okay. Okay.
So they would be able to develop that extra acre there. The reason there's the option for the fee is because a lot of sites are much smaller. And so you're not talking about acres, you're talking about, a few thousand square feet. And so rather than creating a very odd, small little area, they pay the fee in lieu of setting aside that area. And then we're able to use that fee to go and acquire land nearby.
I'm sorry, that causes me to have a thought question. May I?
Commissioner Altman.
Sorry. So since the net is to reduce even more green space, and since we know that dollars never result in an equal amount of environmental protection, because even if you go back and replant, it never reaches the same level of canopy or whatever. Do we have the ability not to accept fee in lieu and they don't get the 10% reduction and this doesn't happen?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to research that and get back to you.
Yeah, it's a good question because I'm wondering, like, why would we do this?
Yeah.
Like, why do we want to agree to this? Why don't we just say no to this? Like, I don't get it.
What I would say is, and I don't want to speak to one of the ones that is possibly being entertained. I think there are some examples. I'm not saying that the bulk of the examples, but I think there are maybe, which is why we haven't received any interest since June 2023. You see, you figured this has been in place since last year. And we've only had one now that's contemplating and asking us to consider it. I think there may be some instances when a site is so constrained that you're doing redevelopment on it. Say you're opening up a coffee shop and it's on a concrete path and it's only X amount of acres and it's very tight and constrained, but yet they still have to put some type of open space requirement on it. And it may be so negligible that the developer's like, do I really have to? Is there some other way, right, wrong, or indifferent? And in those instances, can I buy myself out of having to do this open space? And there may be some instances, I don't know definitively, but there may be some instances where it does just make sense for somebody to be the recipient of the funding stream in order that we can use it to get bigger parcels versus having these little remnants of green space all over the place. But I don't know. And as referenced, we haven't had any that has really come up to us until this one more recent conversation. So I don't know how frequently we're going to get these.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a green space. It could be an urban space that is utilizing this. Because I actually just heard a conversation yesterday. I was part of a conversation where people were saying, this little tiny, they have to put in green space, but it's already concreted.
Exactly.
Right.
So like, it's crazy.
Exactly.
Because we've got a number of sites that are redeveloping at this point.
Oh, okay.
The developer that we're talking to now, it's a very small site. It's between an acre and an acre and a half. And so the amount of open space to set aside there is under 1/10 of an acre.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see this as an opportunity to take advantage and gather fee for multiple sites like that and use it to acquire a larger piece of property that we're able to protect and provide that recreation for. We're not going to be able to go and do anything on 1/10 of an acre, really.
Got it. Thank you.
So you can tell, we're very skeptical of fee in lieu because we've seen what happens. And so I think that option B needs to have something that says these conditions must be met. It can't just be every single person has the option to do a fee in lieu.
Mm.
You have to have some conditions. And I think that's what's missing. So
That's a great
I
point.
think we would all feel better because we do understand there will be the need, but make sure that other people don't take advantage of it. And I know it's an incentive, but they've been very abused.
And another example that I just asked you to entertain in the non-restrictive side, so let's go on the open space side. Say it's in, and I don't know if this is access a location or whatever, but say it's in an area that say it's a big site. It's not the small one that I just referenced. Say it's a big site. And it's getting ready to be, I don't know, how many homes or whatever it may be. And the amount that it gets yield that we could obtain is significant, whatever significant is, be it 10 acres, 15 acres. Say it's a sizable amount of land that we could, and say that it is in a space or site where we don't have any land right now at all, and we need to have a park somewhere, then that may be to our advantage because we can't compete with the developer to buy it. So they've already bought it. Let's also take advantage and have the opportunity to acquire some land in the, and I think we're going to have to try this on and see it on a case-by-case basis. And as we see those individual ones, we're bringing them before you to determine if you think this is okay. So it's not like we do it and you never see it again. What you're endorsing is, okay, this seems like the right process with the additional amendments that y'all may suggest. And then as we try them on and as we get them, bring them and see, and we'll experience what we need to refine and adjust accordingly. That's kind of how I'm seeing it a little bit, but we don't know what we don't know.
So is this gonna be is this policy for us? Or is it just a process? So to your point, when it comes to us, if we want to put additional sort of criteria for a specific developer that, is looking at any of the options. I mean, is this baked policy or is it just a process that can be altered as needed on a case by case?
I'm gonna let Bert and then I'm gonna chime in, because I know you've had more conversations with people.
Yeah, I think we'll have to get clarification on that because this is a mechanism of the city's Unified Development Ordinance, so it's written in such a way. We'd have to see if adding anything else would require a text amendment on the city side. Yeah.
So what I would add is that I would think that when it eventually goes to the board, but we don't have the board action, that you're authorizing a mechanism for receiving funds for the city and or receiving land based on 2 pathways. Now, to that point, that would be the policy. And the policy potentially could also include supported by whatever is the county's procedures, right? And then the procedural piece, of course, we'll share and get it endorsed by you, but if we can be nimble about it as we learn from this year's experience. But not saying that you can't change the policy, but the procedural piece is a little different. And I think these additional things, which are great additional suggestions, particularly like for option B, we do need to put those in, but we may discover something else the next one we have, and I think we would want to have a little bit of flexibility, collective flexibility, that we can tighten this up.
I think that's what I'm driving to. I don't know if we're saying the same thing or not. What I'm trying to solve to is that if we box ourselves in, right, and it's just either or, period. When the deal comes in front of us and it's really, it might be a little fuzzy or just a little hairy, and we say, well, we would do it, but it would be under these circumstances, we would want X, Y, or Z. So I was just trying to figure out if we did have any level of flexibility, but it sounds like if we don't build it in up front, then that wouldn't be the case.
But circle back to what Bert did say, we will have to definitively have legal opinion when we come back. And when it gets presented to the full board, we'll have all of that ironed out. But I hear what you're saying, and we can try to manage to our best we need to.
Well, that's just one commissioner's thought, okay? So I'm not speaking for everybody.
And again, I don't think it would get support, A makes sense. B, I don't think it would get support if it didn't have the criteria, the conditions that must be met. Because of how we've seen other fee and lieu go wrong. And so, flexibility is important, but it's also dangerous sometimes. So.
And I would want the flexibility for A, for us to still be able to say no, because I wouldn't want us to get just remnants that are not of worth. Right.
And I really like how you went through all of the different things that you're considering when we accept a parcel, because for so many years, we've gotten slivers of, what did you call it? Crappy parkland. Like unbuildable. And then the people are saying, oh, we dedicated all these, we gave all this to Parks and Rec, and we can't do anything with it. It's the hardest part of the property. So you don't need any more feedback than that on this, do you?
And at this time, we wanted to tee it up. We wanted to hear your comments and feedback, be able to make it a little bit more nimble based on the comments that we heard. And then when you see the full board meeting, you'll understand what the context is. And we'll have some adjustments based on the feedback.
And are there any questions online? Any questions in the audience? Nope. Okay. Moving on, I will now recognize Aaron Stamforth, our Sustainability and Resiliency Manager with Mecklenburg County, to discuss the Conservation and Preservation Acquisition Draft Framework.
Hello. This is the 4th time we've brought this topic to this group, and we are looking forward to this discussion. What we've done is, and before I kind of dive into that, I do want to say this framework has been an iterative process. We have input from Park and Recreation, legal, real estate, county manager. We've been trying to make this as robust as possible while also keeping that nimbleism, that's not a word, but nimbleness, right, in the process. And so I'm going to dive in. What we've done is we've kind of divvied up the types of parkland by parks, preserves, and greenways. And we're going to talk about the recommendations for each. And then we'll get into our proposed process if and when those kind of restrictions shift for some of our parcels. And so initially for parks, we're recommending deed restrictions, but those deed restrictions are for park and recreation use only as defined by our park and recreation master plan. And if there are proposed changes to those deed restrictions, the deed restriction modification process, which is outlined in like 3-4 slides from here, will be applicable. So we'll get into that the further in we get. But we also recommend that park development continue to adhere to the 50-50 guideline. That's 50% developed, 50% left open and green space. And that's just a guideline that parks uses specific for parks. That's what Park and Rec uses specific for parks, just to be clear. And so going into preserves, we are proposing a tiered process here. So for nature preserves, post acquisition, we are hoping to seek state dedicated conservation easements. That's through the state Department of Natural Resources. Now, if the preserve is not applicable for that particular type of conservation easement, we then recommend seeking out a state dedicated, a local easement through either Catawba Lands Conservancy, Davidson Land Conservancy, or just a local land conservancy. And then if the parcel is not eligible or just applicable for that particular type of easements, we then recommend deed restrictions for habitat preservation and passive recreation only, specific to those particular preserves. And we also are recommending that preserve development continue to adhere to the 90-10 guideline, 90% undeveloped, 10% developed. And that's something that Park and Recreation adheres to now. Going into greenways, greenways actually has not natural, but already existing protection on them. There are swim buffers on most all of our greenways. I cannot remember what SWIM stands for.
Surface water improvement.
surface water improvement management. Thanks to Chris Matthews for that. And so those are quite limiting in terms of what we can and cannot do related to conservation. So we recommend no additional action is needed on greenways because of those swim buffers already in place. So those are our 3 buckets. And now we're going to get into this very detailed, lots of words slide about deed restriction modifications. And so in this situation, what we're outlining here is if we want to change what's in those deed restrictions and or us swapping or selling a particular parcel as a part of a preserve or park, if that's proposed, we're recommending that those propositions go through this process. Essentially, oh, and also I want to add, so these deed restrictions modifications don't apply to ancillary transactions that don't necessarily change the primary function of the park. And so what we're calling out there are utility easements, something along those lines. We're recommending, if modifications are applicable, that we go through a public hearing process with the Board of County Commissioners. And so a staff rep would come to, I'm going to use a poor example. That's the one I keep using and talking about this. Let's say a staff rep comes to the board and says, hey, we want to put an affordable housing complex in the middle of Freedom Park. Can we have a public hearing about that, board? You all say yes. And then we notify all neighbors within half a mile of that particular parcel saying, hey, this proposed change in use is coming. We recommend you come and give your comments to a public hearing at the Board of County Commissioners, either in person or virtually, or you can provide those to us if you're unable to attend the meeting. Public hearing happens then at the following board meeting. And so you all can hear those comments, understand how the public feels about it, and then vote on the proposed change in those deed restrictions. I hope that makes sense. I hope it did.
So you want questions now, or do you want to wait?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the end.
Oh, that was the end. Okay. All right. Okay.
Commissioner Rodriguez McDowell.
Thank you. Can you define ancillary again? I don't know that word. I don't know.
I'll give an example and I'll look to Dr. Johnson to provide some more information. So in talking to real estate about all this, there are transactions where utilities have to come across a preserve or across a park, and those require specific types of easements. I think they're called utility easements. I think there might be another word in there, but it's essentially an easement for utilities. So that would be an example of one.
Okay. So that means that at will, a utility can come through and do whatever they need to do.
Bringing their lines through. We're not saying that a utility would come and develop a particular parcel. Go ahead, Leslie.
But I would say that we still have the process that we normally do with regards to those types of easements and granting the easement. So it's not that you wouldn't know about it. It's just that it doesn't go to the public for that type. It's not being recommended for it to go through the public process of, because the use of the property isn't changing. It's still remaining a park. In many instances, we have utility lines that just go across, but it's still a park. Nothing has changed there. So that's how it's being recommended.
Okay. And just second thing I had a concern about is the half a mile. The half a mile is pretty small.
Yeah.
Can we make that more like at least a mile? If not,
I'm
2
sure
miles?
if that's what if the geography wants to be a larger range, what I'd asked, and I don't know if we got back, I was interested to know when zonings and everything, like there are other protocols that exist in our community with regards to notifying people within a sphere of influence and trying to determine what is that sphere of influence. I don't know if it's a half a mile, 2 miles, right? But we're open to what that is, but we were trying to get some additional guidance with regards to that sphere of influence.
I think it should go as wide as we're allowed to go, if there's some sort of restriction that's outside of our control.
The one thing that I would say, just to be mindful of, that doesn't negate having a larger boundary, is that like when I'm gonna say, like when Park and Rec does notification for capital planning, and I don't know what that buffer is, but typically it's not just noticing and making out, they're trying to get communication to every household in that space as well. So just not saying that we can't do it, but some geographies would have a different type of cost for notifying. I'm not negating it. I'm just saying that that's the other piece that we're trying to manage around as well. But and some of those boundaries may have to be adjusted a little bit. So typically, and and Bert could probably speak from a capital planning, what is the buffer that you typically use for your capital planning?
We start at a half mile and then we look at the geography of the area around that site. If we have like major boundaries, roadways or rail streams or something, we go up to those boundaries because from a practical standpoint, the people kind of inside of that boundary going to, let's say, a small local park would be kind of within that sphere.
Okay. But that doesn't mean that we can't still explore other boundaries. It's just giving you the context of how we came to that number.
I think it really matters as far as, especially with how big the piece is. So if it's a little teeny thing, that's one thing, but if it's a larger area and you only are
Correct.
doing a half a mile, it just doesn't seem adequate.
Correct. And so to get to that, what a possibility could be, all neighbors minimally within a half a mile with determination to, based on project size and scope, to determine if it needs to be a larger boundary. So in theory, we could say minimally it's this on a case by case basis, because I think it does determine, like if it's near 485, we're not going to go into Harrisburg. You know what I'm saying? So it just,
Right.
it kind of depends within the
Okay.
boundaries and stuff like that. But again, this is the opportunity for us to, you to share those types of things and us to take that in and we can retweak accordingly.
Okay, okay. And then my one last comment is, so I think it's curious, like, I don't know, why do we have this language that voting on the change in use will occur directly after the public hearing? Like, what's the purpose of that? Why would you not wait and take the feedback, think about it and then do it? Like, why would you do it right?
Sure. So we worked with the clerk's office on the process and it's intended to mirror what we heard during the budgeting process. But that's not to say that we can't augment it to have it.
You can have it separate.
Right, of course.
If that's it can be both ways. It can,
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it doesn't really happen that way with the budget hearing. Like, we don't hear and then vote that same night.
no, the place that it shows up in some instances, sometimes there are some public hearings that we have that is the same day and you vote the same day.
Right.
They're not a whole lot of them, but there are several of them that happen that way versus public hearing, then it shows up on the next agenda item. But if that's again, that's something that's can be easily modified and say, oh, nope, you want to have the public hearing. And then at a subsequent meeting, you would take vote on what you decide to do with regards to that public use.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's important. I just remember this recent example in Pineville where you know what I'm talking about, and then they took the vote, and it's better to have some space so that the board can actually take in the feedback from the community. It's not just tokenized feedback.
That's fair.
Okay. Sorry if I went on and on.
Oh, no, it's okay. We have the whole meeting is for this.
Okay.
Commissioner Altman?
Where you say the second bullet, first approval vote is to hold a public hearing. There's actually not a vote then, right? We're just having a hearing and then we're having a vote at a later date.
What she has recommended is really 3 steps. Step 1 is Board of County Commissioners, are you willing to have a public hearing on the possibility of the proposed change use, right? And then you're agreeing that, because typically you have to agree to have a public hearing. So that becomes a board action for you to agree to have a public hearing. Then after you agree to have a public hearing, it gets noticed. After it gets noticed, then you have that public hearing. And then it's the subsequent decision-making, be it that same day or afterwards.
When do we vote on having a public hearing?
It's an agenda item independent. You have agenda items that it slides in and says, it may show up on
We have to make
consent,
a motion.
but it says that, is the board willing to have a public hearing on fees or the public hearing on this or that? And so it's a requested board action to to have a public hearing.
Right.
You don't have it for budget in the sense of there's that second budget hearing, which is after the county manager's recommended budget, is statutory required. So that one you have to do.
Like I recall voting to open a public hearing.
Open a public hearing.
But I don't recall voting to
To
hold
hold
a
it.
public hearing at a future date.
Okay, that's, okay.
But we do?
I think you have on some instances
I
of
think they're
ask,
consents. Yeah, they're
Okay.
consent items.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
but what I can say that we could do is we could validate and confirm with the clerk and the attorney and ensure that our protocol for this is consistent with however we do it, be it to open and whatever. But I think there's instances where we're asking you, can we put it on the agenda to do it? Because that then allows the clerk to notice it. So when you're basically, it may not be phrase how you're saying it, but you're basically agreeing to have a public hearing. And then when you agree to have the public hearing, then it allows us to notice the public hearing.
Yeah.
So, but we'll make sure the legal jargon is consistent, because I don't, and the other thing that I'd probably say, and Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, because you and the team pulled this together because I'm doing, I think the intent of this, right, wrong, or indifferent, is to tell you the steps. It may not be the legal phraseology.
Oh, yeah.
But we need to, not, that doesn't negate it. We need to get that right.
And that's 100% true. And I will say one other thing. The reason that we phrased it in this way is to elevate the public awareness and the board awareness of this potential change in the deed restriction modifications. So that's intentional.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Jewell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So a couple things I want to, I want to go to bullet point 3 and offer a perspective that really might address some unintended consequences of expanding the boundary. It's something I want us to be mindful of as we move forward. A lot of times, particularly in our space of parks, and I'm just going to be blunt with respect to this. A lot of times communities of color are not showing up, not because they don't care, not because they don't support parks, but because of different circumstances. And a lot of times when we look at our maps, those communities of color are surrounded by other communities that dominate the discussion. And I will give you an example. If you take Greer Heights Park, I know you guys are familiar with that. If you look what's around Greer Heights Park, a lot of communities really care about the part, and my Greer Heights community does as well. But if we have a meeting, if you expand that boundary, it is not going to be reflective of those that are proximate to Greer Heights Park that live in that neighborhood. So I'm not saying don't expand the boundary, but I also want us to really be mindful of when we think about folks that will be a part of the public hearing, and we can think about people that show up to our public hearings now, right? They may not necessarily be reflective of the voices that are proximate that could not show up, particularly if you widen that. So if, my folks from Elizabeth or Cotswold or, other areas that are surrounding Myers Park that are very, very proximate to that, they dominate a discussion, but they don't really have to deal with the impact because those people that live there. So I'm not saying that we don't consider expanding the boundary, but I think it could be a both and, where maybe we have to take extra steps to protect those and find different mechanisms for those communities that don't necessarily have the ability to come to whether it's a committee meeting, our board meeting, or other ways. There needs to be another level of engagement and weight those voices that are directly in the community.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, I know you're an individual, not the group as a whole.
Yes.
I offer this as a possibility if the group as a whole is interested. You have the official public hearing, but I think there is an opportunity to do an additional community engagement. And that additional community engagement would hopefully be aligned to a time that we think works for all, to possibly have representation like we do. Like when we do capital planning, it's not in the public hearing environment. We're doing it in the evening or the weekends or some other time that we think that is more accessible for a broader group. So if that's something that, again, as input, we could modify that accordingly based on that input.
Yeah, and I'd like to, however we have to, I don't want to get married to how we do it, but I would like for us to solve to making sure that those that are most proximate to it they don't get dominated by folks that are outside of that radius.
Do you think different language would work? Like if you said neighborhood instead of half a mile or mile, like like how do we speak about the proximate, like how do you describe who's proximate, you know, do you say neighborhood, like instead of a number? Is it a different word?
No, that's a great question. I think in some respects, I'm just not, I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
I think it's a great
I
point.
think, but, again, I don't, I'll accept where the group wants to go with whatever would make the most sense. And I don't want to muddy the waters too much, but I think we have to be mindful, particularly as we lean in with these, these discussions around equity and different things of that nature. I think we just gotta figure out if it's a different type of language. Is it a both and, or, how do we frame it and shape it?
And while we have not crafted whatever would be the policy of the framework or whatever, as you know, in some policies we have, or whatever, we have the whereas statements or whatever, there may be an opportunity to include language that speaks to what the intent is, in addition to itemizing the minimal expectations. Like, in minimal expectations may be that you have a public hearing, at least one public hearing, and one additional community engagement session, with the intent to have broad reach over the reach of the diversity of the neighborhood and blah, blah, blah. I don't know what the language would be, but we could possibly package it that way. So the intent isn't lost. The minimal requirement of what we need to do is specified, and we could do more.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So I'm going to take a turn and then we can go like from the beginning to like start with nature preserves, but since it applies to this. So one of the things that I really like about the draft is public awareness. Because so many things happen and by the time the public becomes aware, it's too late. So I think public awareness is really important, and there are some things that I think need to be tweaked. But it is, like, personally unnerving to me that there would ever be a modification that didn't go through Park and Rec and the Park and Rec Commission first. And so I think that we should add that there would be a meeting, perhaps like you described, on a weekend, where park staff and the Park Commission met with the communities closest to any kind of modification being proposed. I think that needs to be a step that happens before it comes to the board.
I don't, and maybe I'm speaking out of school here, I don't think that any proposed modification would not include park and recreation in that discussion. That's just.
Right,
It
yes.
wouldn't happen independent, and maybe that needs to be a bit more transparent.
It has happened.
Well-
And so in my life history, it has happened and bad things came of it. So I think that we definitely have to include it in the draft.
Sure.
To say that Park and Rec, from the Park and Rec director all the way to, they need to be aware of whatever the modification, they need to initiate it.
Typically it is, what I definitely completely concur, and I'm gonna say that in the conversation that Erin had with the county manager, clearly, I just want to be transparent. She talked about staff participation and how she presented it to Dina. She talked about the importance of, when we're talking about these changes, to engage a cross-section of people as we move forward. She also expressed that, how can I best convey what she said, that when we get to the piece about, no, we didn't talk about staff engagement at the community engagement piece, because the whole community engagement piece just came up. It was only about the public hearing. But what I would say is that once it becomes public, the public input includes multiple pieces of input, which would include the advisory board. Because when we do regular land acquisition, that's typically in closed session. But when we're talking about change in use, the intent is, yes, we need to make the public aware that the board is contemplating change of use, and then have inputs, be it the PRC, be it the neighborhood, be it others who want to express. So that has always been the envisioned state. But I think if the intent to say inclusive community input, I think we can definitely put that as the part of the phraseology of what we're talking about. Because you may find out it's more than the Park and Rec Commission that wants to convey. It may be other types of advisory boards that have, depending on what you're speaking about, that want to have input about this as well. So I think it could be more than just the Park and Rec, because I don't know what the use is, but say the use is housing. Somebody else that's on another advisory board may have an input with regards to it. Or it could be somebody that stormwater says, oh yeah, when you do this, we also want you to take this in consideration as well as you're thinking about the change of use. So it could be more than the Park and Rec Commission. I think it would be advisory boards in general. Could be, not saying that you will get everybody, but I think the input could be more than just the PRC.
It could be PRC, it could be Stormwater Advisory
Could be.
Council. I don't know, like, it's scary to think about people trying to put housing in parkland. But there need to be as many public awareness as possible. And so we need to build it in. We need to have it strong from the beginning and not say, oh, we forgot that.
And it can be done. Please don't think that my commentary isn't that it can't be done. It definitely can be done. I just wanted to let you know that it was always discussed that it would have input from the public, but we can ensure in this step that we also can make it so that if it becomes a phraseology within the policy, that it talks about the public input being from the broad.
It can be broad, but it has to include Park Commission because it's parkland. And so I don't know how you skip the Park Commission on parkland. And
You don't skip them.
right. And so, because there are a lot of stormwater implications on our properties. So I thought of that before I got here today. I thought Stormwater Advisory Council would probably be another board that we would want to hear from. You know, we appoint these boards and, you know, as in the past week, I've received phone calls of, why do we even have advisory boards? You don't even bring it to us. You make these decisions without even bringing it to us. And so that it's not going to I'm not going to vote for something that didn't go through park staff and Park Commission. And I just wanted to say that while we were on this conversation, and now we can start at the front at nature preserves, if anybody has questions about that. Commissioner Rodriguez
Are
McDowell,
you talking about this paper now?
So what's
are you going to go over this later?
So that is what's listed here. It's
It's
the
just a
same
different-
thing.
Right.
It's
There's
just-
more
There's
though.
More on this than on this. This is just like bullet points. So that's what I was trying to understand, if we were to this yet, or we're still back. Are
We
going
can
backwards?
share that, certainly.
Because I had a concern on the, am I missing some papers? I don't know. I had a concern on this, oh, I see, yeah. I didn't want to jump the gun on this. So if we're not there yet, I can wait.
I think we're there because there's nothing extra you were going to review, is there? Yeah, so we still have time.
Okay, all right.
So for anyone that's tuning in
I'm pulling it
or,
up, yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
This is the printed, this doesn't have pictures or anything. This is the printed draft of the Conservation and Preservation Acquisition Framework. Commissioner Rodriguez McDowell.
Okay, so on the very first line, it says for park properties purchased in FY 25 and beyond. And like, why are we only talking about FY 25 and beyond? What about all that we already have? Especially all of our
Second.
ELAP stuff and
Yeah,
anything before that even.
I believe there's the opportunity for it to be from from the Environmental Leadership Action Plan forward. So that's FY 21 and beyond.
And you don't think we can go back and do,
I would say
prior to that?
I'd say let us assess it, because I don't know what that, let us assess it. Not saying that it can't, let me assess it to understand what does that look like from what we wanted to do today is to say, okay, does the framework seem right? If you think like, okay, yep, we like this, deed restriction, state, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, let's go and understand, if we had to do this from FY 21 forward, what does that look like? Because then we have to start taking legal actions and all this other stuff. So let's understand what that looks like and what's that universe and start there before just saying, let's go all the way back. Because you also got to be mindful of some of our parkland that we received from the city, we use parkland only, already has the deed restrictions on it. So now we've got to figure out, okay, what's the acreage, and Jacqueline did provide me, what we've purchased thus far, and can we get deed restrictions on all of these properties? Can we go through and see state assessment and everything for nature preserve? So we've got a lot of working even to go from 21 forward, because we bought a lot.
And I will say this, there's a significant staffing requirement that would be needed to get there. We've talked about that within parks, we talked about that within real estate, just to go all the way back to FY 21. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I want that to be really transparent. There's a significant amount of staff time that would come with that. Yes, ma'am.
And this is so important that like we approve the budget and we will add the staff. Like it is like, that should not be anything that causes this not to be a strong framework. But thank you for the mindfulness, because
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just going to use this illustratively. Doesn't mean all of them would apply, but if we were to put, and this is just me doing rough math, 24, we're over 1,000 acres that we would need to try to manage to. And when we're saying acres, of course, that's not the parcels, but we need to figure out how many different parcels does that equal? Because in some instances, we buy multiple parcels. And so the legal transactions and stuff that we need to do with that. And that's kind of why we were just saying, I think they were saying, they said FY 25, but I know that we were thinking about working it backwards and trying to see how does that
Right.
work.
That makes
With the
sense.
intent, with the ELAP monies, because that's when it was intentional, purposeful. We're putting more money, sole purpose for this, make it go forward. But again, it's a lot that we've got to work through to get to that.
But going backwards from the present,
Correct.
so start
As well
now
as
and
well as
then-
moving
Okay.
forward, right? So trying to,
Right,
and it may take us a couple years. I mean, I don't know how long, because I don't know what we don't know, right?
right.
To figure out what does that look like to get to that end.
Mhm.
As well as, I'm going to use for the nature preserves illustratively, 1, 2. Nature's preserves may about 400 acres or so like that. So then, because the first step, the way it's presented is we go and we have conversations with the state. And so trying to work through those processes and make it manageable and stuff like that. So
Okay.
it looks like Chris has something to say
Okay.
on that subject.
and before, like, can you tell me, Leslie, what you said? Because we're saying that a bare minimum, we want to see all the ELAP dollars, but that's a bare minimum. So can you say what you said you were going to do? You were going to study it? You said something.
So I said, what I was basically saying
Assess.
is, you were asking, can we go further back? And I'm saying, let us work with FY 21 forward, because roughly, and it's, all of it doesn't, but if I was to count it, we know that it's over 800 acres easily, right? I haven't done the math to take out, but it's probably close to it. I haven't done the math because it's not as easy as I wanted to make it. But what I do know is several hundred thousands of, almost 1,000 of acres, right? That we've got to figure out, what does that mean? And acres, while it's not a 1-for-1, the agglomeration sometimes are multiple parcels. So we've got to figure out legally, what does that mean? How do we go through the process, this, that, and the other? Based on this frame, if it's this framework, how many of them would require deed restrictions? So legally, what does that require? How do we make that happen? The process, get them logged on the register of deeds. There's a whole legal process for deed
So you
restriction.
said you're just going to get an assessment, like, because
No. I guess let me make
What's
sure
the
I'm
word?
clear.
like,
The FY 21 for, we can, I see the alignment for when we started the Environmental Leadership Action Plan forward, yes. How quickly we can do it, that's a whole nother story, because I don't know, we can't say that all this will happen in 1 year. So the assessment is trying to understand how many parcels are we talking about in this acreage that would have to be required for deed restrictions? How many parcels would we have to?
I got it. I
That's
got
it,
it.
okay.
But what I'm saying is, she said all park properties. So, the bare minimum is 21 forward, but
Right.
really, how can we protect all of them? And so we're gonna get an assessment.
To get to that end, I think, yes, we can do an assessment, but I want to manage your expectations. That assessment isn't going to be able to be done just like that, right? Because the assessment, the first focus that I think would be the most important priority is this 50 and 30 and all these millions of dollars that we've just invested in these past 3 or 4 years. And really, not saying that the other isn't important, but the staff commitment to do that is going to take a whole lot in of itself, because no one has planned it from the attorney's perspective. No one's done it from a cost perspective because there's legal requirements. So
wait.
that's what I'm saying, that we need to be clear on the cost, resources, and everything to execute all of that. Then after we get through all of that, then determine if the board is directing, then can we start looking at past? But I don't think that we should try to take it all off at this time because it's too much to take on.
I hate for that to keep us from doing, what is right, but like, we'll just, I guess, get this first chunk going. I know you had a question, Chris?
Just a comment. So just to be clear, we're actively working on state dedicated conservation easements for nature preserves. And in fact, today is a historic day. On June the 4th of 2002, the board action said that we're going to put state dedicated conservation easements on as many nature preserves as we can, and it applies to the entire system. So just for clarity, and I think I sent an email to Aaron about this on Friday, we are actively doing state dedicated conservation easements on nature preserves where they apply. We have 4 that we're working on right now, and we will continue to do that per the 2002 board action.
So on the first, because the first chunk, has nature preserves in there. So every time we acquire a nature preserve, we pursue state dedication. Thanks to Ruth Samuelson, who really worked hard in 2002 who really didn't give up and had a unanimous energy to protect our nature preserves. So I think we need to have a conversation, because some nature preserves, like there's a 90-10 in there. Some nature preserves where if you develop 10% of it, it would be a disaster. So I have written it down. Like, we acquired a nature preserve, we have a couple of them where there are endangered asters and sunflowers where you can't do any development. So can we get better language on this?
Yeah, so we're currently working on a series of maps for each one of our nature preserves to where we are actually going to designate, if development occurs, this is the area that it would occur. Some nature preserves won't be able to receive development because of the sensitivity of them. And we'll make that an artifact of not only our natural resources management plan, but also working with Bert's team for capital planning. So we're working on a modification to this because honestly, we don't want to be in a position of having to develop up to 10% of all of our nature preserves. It's really a more science-based approach where can the nature preserve actually accept it? And if so, where? And we want to make sure that areas that we are identifying in nature preserves for limited development, which would be like a little parking lot or a trailhead or a bathroom or something like that, is actually a location that works for access, and it's a location that works for the property. So we're looking to modify this a little bit because it seems a little too ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to make sure that we make a better record of what our decisions are.
So that would be nice to have a better language there, because, and are you going to be doing this for, I know that we pursue state dedication on every nature preserve, but are you going to have this plan for even the old nature preserves or just the new ones?
Yeah, so some nature preserves don't meet the criteria for state dedication. So in this particular process, if we go to second tier and work with local lands conservancies, this will become part of that discussion as well.
And does this, the description here, it says post-acquisition, it doesn't inhibit us from buying anything that already has a conservation easement on it.
Right, correct. But we wouldn't pursue the easement or what have you before it was acquired, if that makes sense.
Totally, like you pursue it after, but
Mhm.
it doesn't,
Already acquire one that has one, then that would just come with the property.
okay.
Like, yeah.
Be natural, they already exist and they just will transfer over. That's only when there's nothing on the property and you have to start.
And if I can add just one more thing in response to the conversation we were having a minute ago about just representation, a piece of this that has been baked in but isn't stated outright, during the land acquisition process, what's shared with the board in closed session, we're recommending that the conservation methodology for whatever we're acquiring be shared during that time. Not that we're trying to get an easement on something before we own it, but just recommending easement, deed restriction, what have you, to the board at the same time as the acquisition comes.
Thank you.
The one other thing that Chris did not mention, and I can see if you take, this is, I'm gonna call it the get it down draft, get to the actions to it. It's not the literal final legal jargon. With the 90-10, how it's applied today, that's the maximum utilization that plays out. Most of the time, the language is it's passive, so it's never that it's, in those nature preserves, it's never that you get like this active recreation. Most of the time, with the nature preserves, they're passive recreation, so you're getting on the trail, you're getting a bench, you're getting a restroom, you're not getting the other things that you're typically seeing at a park. And then the other thing that, as Chris noted, is just because it says adhere to it, they're trying to be consistent in language there, I guess. There's some instances that we don't do it at all, just because it just doesn't make sense for the site. We try not to go over the 10 if we so choose that there's an opportunity at the site. So it's not that every nature preserve has 10% activity on it. It's when we do it, we don't want to make it more than that.
It's my experience though, that people want to push it, like, and I don't mean park staff, but people want to push it, especially like Lada. Oh, we want sewer all the way down to Mountain Island Lake, and we need this, and now we're gonna pave this parking lot because this person doesn't like the dusty car. And I think, wow, they're really pushing that to the limit on some of our nature preserves. And so I think that nature preserves need to be the ultimate in protection, and we need to have clear language that protects our nature preserves and isn't ambiguous. And so I think the language needs to be a little bit better on that. And then there was a mention of greenways. It's great when they have swim buffers and they're protected, but it says consider deed restrictions. I think this is essential, like it's cross out consider, like we need to have deed restrictions on our greenways too. Like we need to protect that as well. And so I have a concern about that.
I'll speak to that one. That was actually, it wasn't in the PowerPoint. It should have been in the PowerPoint, and let me explain why it's considered to be removed. With greenways, a lot of times we're not even buying the parcels, we're getting easements from property owners, and in those instances we can't. So it's kind of like a little bit more challenging with greenways, other than those things that are already dictated in the swim buffers, because we're not always acquiring the parcel. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not. And so in that instance where it wasn't that everyone, and you're getting, like say if this is a segment and you're dealing with different owners, so this one you make, most of the time we're getting, more of the times I think we're getting easements than actually acquiring from the owners. When we're acquiring one, and that may be something that was being entertained with it, is when we're acquiring the land, if it is one that's like for a long segment and it's not in a swim buffer, is that something that we then elevate on a case-by-case basis versus itemizing it and seeing it's a definitive, because we just don't know. Because a lot of times in the greenways, we're not buying land. Because that was the intent.
And so like for me, if, as long as you have park experts looking at it saying like, like if Bert could say, yeah, I think we need a deed restriction on that, I would feel comfortable. Or if Bert thought we didn't need it, I'd feel comfortable.
Let's be clear, Bert, Chris, And everybody else from us, everybody. from this-
Well, team.
Well, but I just want to
Team.
make sure that, because you're saying something that's giving me pause, and I just want to make sure you're clear. When we have land acquisition conversations, Bert and Chris are at every one of those conversations. And we talk about what we should be doing, how we should be doing it, and they're present, and we will continue to have them to be present. And
I want-
they're valuable inputs, I mean.
For
so we
sure.
can- I don't want you to think that we're not including them when things get presented to the board.
Okay, all right. And so let me check my colleagues. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, well, I had a couple comments real quick.
Commissioner
Chair.
Jarrell?
Thank you. So one, I just wanted to say to staff, while we're having this conversation or these conversations, I really appreciate the fact that even when we may be somewhat disconnected, but I really appreciate getting clarity on the whys, like what you were thinking. So I just wanted to start there and just say thank you, because it really does demonstrate how thoughtful you all are as you're going through this, and then being able to take our feedback and try to synthesize that. So I just wanted to start there. The other thing that I wanted to ask, so with respect to going back to FY '21 and moving forward, when do you think we would have an idea of what that would look like? And really, I do think it's important, and the chair mentioned this earlier, I do think it's important for us to understand the staff that would be needed, what that time could look like, and just lay out some timeline so that we have clarity around what this process looks like, right? And then what's the resource need, so that, to your point, we're going into budget and we're saying, okay, we're making specific asks for a specific reason, or, you can shape it, but we understand what we're trying to accomplish. But I'm assuming we feel like we have the resources right now for FY '25 moving forward. At least we feel like that's locked. We're good to go. It's just that backward facing look. We need to figure out what this staff time looks like.
That's good. If the board says
Thank you,
that
Madam
this
Chair.
kind of work is good based on the feedback that you said, we're gonna retreat based on everything you said. We can easily amend our process moving forward to take care of everything we take forward, moving forward, starting at 1st. With regards to going back, it almost has to be tiered. The two tiers that I would talk about, the two spaces that we need to assess is nature preserves and parks. I'm not discounting the agreements, but I'm gonna start with nature preserves and parks, because those are the biggest chunks of land we put on. And you can see, like, we just use it right now. So these may not help in this entirety, these triangles and easements, but all of these dots. So like trying to understand, okay, what would it take to do, is this just one? And two, and just kind of work with our attorneys and understand in this fiscal year for FY '24, what would it take? Have them assess, because it's recorded in the deed, what's the cost? Because we've never done any of that kind of assessment. And give us some time, I'm gonna say like the 30 days or whatever, because I don't have the attorney on with us to understand, okay, what would it take based on what we see here? We have another map that's FY '23, and try to get us a roadmap of what we think it would look like. Oh,
I think Susan just chimed in.
okay.
Right.
But
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to point out that before we put any restrictions going backwards, whenever we've been talking about this, we were kind of talking about FY '25 forward. So then we could kind of, as we're evaluating what we do, whenever the county buys a piece of property, a title search is done. We look to be sure what's on the property, if there's any existing restrictions, all the legal, all the easements, all that sort of thing that are on the property already. So whenever we're looking at this as going forward, then we can kind of take those into account and be sure that any restrictions we're going to put on the property aren't going to violate, say, any existing easements that are already on the properties. So I just wanted to point out that if we go backwards, then we're basically going to have to go back and revisit the title on every piece of property to be sure that we're not going to violate anything that's on the property already. Does that make sense?
it's a lot to the process. And that's why I said the assessment piece of trying to understand. Now, what we may be able to do, and I tried to oversimplify it this way, give us that time. I mean, I understand the importance and the desire, and we want to get you there. But it is a lot legally to make that happen. And so let us try to determine, let us assess, just like FY24 and use it as a case and try to see, are they, and we may have to say, based on the past 3 years, I'm just using illustratively, here's our big priority ones, because they were big parcels that we got and we want to do it that way. But give us the time to try to understand what it would take, because I just don't know. I just know that this is the right direction. It just requires way more than we've ever planned to get us there, because it's easier doing, like she said, moving forward, but we're committed to try to figure out how do we get it backwards. I just don't know how.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Susan. So on parcels, current park parcels that we own, where there might not be a deed restriction, where somebody might offer, or where they want to have some kind of modification, how do we, because this is the place to put it, how do we improve the process, the public process?
So what we could do in the interim, right, so like the things can go concurrently, right? So we could, in the interim, say, if there's any proposed change of use, because when the board takes action, it's not a deed restriction, but you have already said it is for park purpose. So if as we're trying to figure out how do we go back to 21, there may be an interim process until we figure that out that says if there is a proposed change of use that the board recommends that we have a public engagement process moving forward that will then address anything going back as we're trying to figure out how do we go back, if that makes sense.
So I think we need to put the interim process in.
No, yeah, if that's what you want.
Oh, I think everyone agrees. If you don't agree, let me know. Commissioner Altman.
Thank you. Well, a couple things. This framework it is a framework, and it's a lot of great work. I didn't see this previously, so I can see that you've achieved something significant, and I like the direction that you're going. So I want to acknowledge that. Like, this is definitely an improvement from the last time we were together where we didn't even have a framework. So happy.
Okay.
I want to say that. And I want to, like my dad was a real estate attorney. This is a lot of work. I totally want to just recognize what an unbelievably heavy lift is being talked about here. I want to thank our chairwoman. She's the tippy point of a spear. And I know she makes me be a better advocate in this space. I think she moves all of us in a direction that we want to go with her zealous advocacy, and I salute you for it.
Thank you.
I salute you for it. So I think staff did a great job with this framework, and I appreciate, again, with the 30 years of history that Commissioner Powell has working in this space, helping us to make it even better. I love it that you guys said that you're, every time we make a purchase right now going forward in closed session, you'll be making a recommendation as to what sort of vehicle we should adopt. If we do acquire it, we should implement at the time we acquire it. So that's fantastic. That means going forward, we're going to lock and load. So we don't continue to acquire properties that are not protected. And, I appreciate Commissioner Rodriguez McDowell pointing out we shouldn't prohibit ourselves from looking before 2025. That's not what we want to do. I completely agree, and I'm glad that you started there. But what Dr. Johnson basically was saying, that I think we said at our last meeting, is let's triage. Let's figure out the largest parcels, the ones that are most ecologically vulnerable, and develop a list. And because I don't want to spend, just because we said we want it all done, it's not strategic for us to spend a bunch of time on all these that may not have a lot of value. We need to be more strategic because there is more than can get done in a year, for sure. So I would recommend, agreeing with everything that y'all said, that we do come back with a prioritization list and you know, get on it. But this is tremendous improvement and progress. And thank you.
Can I just respond to that real quick?
Thank
Just
you.
a brief little tiny 10 seconds.
Sure.
So in this process, and when I say we, I mean sustainability, park and rec, real estate, legal, came up with, I'm going to say, a low-hanging fruit list. It is a broad list, but it's a list nonetheless. So I think we've got a handful of things we could work with. Not to say that what we came up with is going to necessarily be an easement or deed restriction, what have you, but I know that we have vulnerable properties that we've identified.
And so, yes, I mean, we were preparing to get to this place, right? What I would say is, you know, thank you for all the comments. It was been a collective input process to get us to where we are. We wanted to have a good enough framework for you to react to, for us to say, okay, are we on the right path for us to start implementing? What I think I've heard, and I know we have minutes, but I want to just make sure I'm clear with regards to our direction and like, so this has to still go before the full board, but we will make these amendments as we move forward. FY25 and beyond, we're going to say that if we get the board endorsement in this is what we're going to do moving forward. To include, as we're presenting stuff to closed sessions, we start itemizing and telling you how we want to proceed with these respective parcels. Second thing that I've heard is that we will tighten up the language with regards to the 90-10. It was like us throwing spaghetti noodle on the wall, but I heard that what we need to do there and understanding that that's only when it's applicable, because it's not always, and also about the passive use and the like. We've talked about the swim buffers and why that nuance is there, but again, we're going to have the staff engagement part to make sure that when we're talking about these outliers, which ones we should and should not apply as it relates to that. With regards to community engagement, what I also heard is, one, we will immediately, assuming the board starts this, we will do community engagement if anything else that is in the park land space today is being proposed as another use, we would adhere to what we have identified as our public engagement process. With regards to, similar to the deed restriction, but I'm just calling that the public engagement process. With regards to the public engagement process, what I heard there is that language couldn't get to the expressions of what the intent meant when we're saying for reaching diversity and the like around the neighborhoods. Also talking about broad public input to include the advisory boards, i.e. like PRC. We also talked about having possibly as our itemization minimally 2 public engagements. One would be the public hearing. The second one, another community engagement opportunity that could be not at the chamber at another time for public input. We talked about clearing out this last bullet that talks about the voting will occur immediately past the meeting, but yet rather it would be at a subsequent meeting. We also talked about being more clear with regards to the steps, be it that do you have to have the step to approve, to have a public hearing, or could we just go to the open the public hearing and the like? So just being clear in how we itemize those types of things with regards to the steps. And then I think there was one other commentary that I may have had, but I think that's the host of it, but of course we'll reconcile within minutes.
So a couple things. And maybe it's in there somewhere, maybe I missed it. The public interim process.
Yep.
So
Starting assuming the board adopts it, the interim process would be, we would adhere to what we will outline as the public engagement process. So if anything in theory gets recommended that doesn't have the deed restriction on it, but is a park purpose, anything that's being proposed as a different park purpose, assuming your endorsement as a board, we would implement this modification process.
Okay.
Public engagement process.
So just to be clear, like really, I feel like we all want this, tell me if I'm wrong, the public interim process with our advisory boards, with the park commission. And I know you said it earlier, but I like that, you know, everyone works together, but I feel like it's parkland. And so if there's going to be any kind of modification, the process should be initiated by the Park and Recreation Director. A lot of these things that come to us that we can't speak about publicly feel like they came from developers. And if there's going to be a modification, it really needs to be initiated, in my view, by the Park and Recreation Director or the expert on his or her staff that is the most familiar with that parkland. And so I think that's part of the interim process. And I keep thinking of James Worsley, if you knew him. He was so great at making sure the public was engaged every step of the way. And so I hope he'd be honored that I was talking about him today, because he's a Park and Recreation Director in another area. And I just really admire his approach. And I feel like it's gotten lost, and I don't want it to be lost. And so how do we make sure that if there is any change to any parkland that we bought with taxpayer dollars, that all of Park and Recreation staff is recognized and listened to, but also the public that owns that parkland. And so we're just trying to make this as strong as possible. And I do understand better, and I'm really glad Commissioner Jarrell talked about it, about like explaining the why of the framework, like how you got here. I really appreciate the work. And like, we want it to be strong because we've dedicated so much to environmental leadership that you don't want to leave it vulnerable. And I don't think just a few parcels are vulnerable. I think a significant chunk of it is vulnerable. And how do we decrease the vulnerability? And I think a much more public process helps. And
The good, I would say, is Jacqueline is rock solid, right? And what I mean by that, and she's training her team, we get requests all the time for people to ask to buy our property. And the answer is no, a resounding no. And that's probably your most fragile opportunity right there. When we are asking people, they see our big parcels and they want it for development, and she tells them no. And so that is like the biggest piece there. And we haven't had recently that I can think of. Well, we did, but it didn't pass. But I can only think of recently one potential alternative use for parkland in the last 5+ years or whatever. That one, whatever. But there was board support for some of that.
exactly. And so what happens when developers pay lobbyists to come to commissioners to try and flip parkland? Like, these are serious vulnerabilities. And the more layers of protection that we add now, the more livable Mecklenburg County will be for generations to come. Like, this is serious work. And so thank you to everyone who worked on it. Thank you to everyone who's going to work harder on it and make it better, because it needs to be great. It needs to be strong. And I'm glad that you said what you said, because I think that an interim process, like, it gave birth to that in my head. And I thought, man, we really need to have a strong interim process while we're exploring all this legal stuff. So are there any more? Oh, I want to make sure anyone in the audience, if you have a question, let me know. Any burning questions? Sean?
I was gonna say, no burning questions. No burning questions, but if it would be appropriate, I think the land trusts in this community would be happy to speak to the Board of Commissioners or to this committee at a future meeting about what the process looks like to initiate the process of getting a conservation easement on preserves properties. This is something we do every single day. We've worked with hundreds of landowners across this region, and we'd be more than happy to go into what that process actually looks like.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Are there any questions online? Any closing comments, Commissioner Jarrell?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Rodriguez McDowell?
No, I guess the one thing I want to say is that, I think that I think it's our desire to make this a real line in the sand, a real movement toward preservation. And we want it to really be meaningful. So that's why there's so much scrutiny And I think this is a huge move for us. It's important. Yeah. Thank you.
Commissioner Altman?
Yes, hi, sorry. Beth Matthias with Davidson Lands Conservancy, and I was just gonna say similar
Can
to
you
what
stand
Sean-
up?
Yep, similar to what Sean said, you know, we're here to support and help. The one question and maybe just something to think about leaving, it's outlined preserves, greenways and parks, but there's no distinction between active and passive. And I know, for example, we've had things go through the state preserve process that are passive parks right now, but weren't appropriate to meet the state standards. So maybe some additional definitions around those distinctions would be really helpful as this moves forward from here. So.
Thank you. And Beth, you're the new director for Davidson Lands Conservancy? Is that correct? This is my first time seeing you, so welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Are there any questions online? Did I already ask you that, Aaron? Okay. If anybody has any comments, please email us. We love your comments and we read all of them. Thank you. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Altman, seconded by Commissioner Rodriguez McDowell. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The meeting is adjourned. 2:12 p.m.